There is a country in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that very few people in the world could point to on a map, and yet it holds one of the most fascinating stories on the entire African continent. An archipelago that was born uninhabited, that became a mandatory stop for navigators, slave traders, and even scientists like Charles Darwin, and that today survives through a mix of resilience, music, and a dish capable of uniting entire families around a single plate. Today we're going to explore Cape Verde from beginning to end, and I promise that by the end of this video, you'll know more about this country than the vast majority of people on the planet. Before we continue, if you enjoy this kind of content, give the video a like and subscribe with the bell turned on so you never miss any of the journeys we have planned for you. 1. A country born from nothing, without a single original inhabitant. Unlike almost any other African territory, Cape Verde had no human population before the arrival of Europeans. When Portuguese navigators first spotted these 10 volcanic islands in the 15th century, they found a completely uninhabited territory, with no trace of prior human settlement. Everything we know today as Cape Verdean identity, its language, its music, its cuisine, was built from scratch from that moment on, something quite rare in the history of colonization. 2. A name that doesn't actually describe the islands themselves. It's curious that the name Cape Verde doesn't refer to any geographic feature of the islands themselves, but to a cape located on the western coast of continental Africa, the reference point Portuguese navigators used to orient themselves during the crossing. In other words, the country is named after a place that isn't even within its own territory. 3. The first European city ever built in the tropics anywhere on the planet. In 1462, just 6 years after the first Portuguese arrived, a settlement was founded on the island of Santiago that is known today as Cidade Velha, the Old City, formerly called Ribeira Grande. This small place has the historic honor of being the first permanent European colony ever established anywhere within the tropical belt of the world, a milestone that marked the beginning of European colonial expansion beyond the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, and whose importance is still recognized internationally today. 4. A past directly tied to the trade of enslaved people. For centuries, Cape Verde functioned as one of the key hubs of the transatlantic slave trade, a mandatory stopover between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Its geographic position, halfway between the 3 continents, made it a strategic waypoint both for the human trade and for supplying whaling and merchant ships. This dark and painful past irreversibly shaped the country's ethnic and cultural identity and remains an active topic of historical memory among Cape Verdeans themselves. 5. The man who became a symbol of an entire independent struggle. In 1956, a political movement was born underground that would forever change the fate of 2 African nations. The African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, founded by Amilcar Cabral, became the backbone of the region's anti-colonial struggle. Cabral was assassinated in 1973, barely 2 years before his dream became reality, and his legacy is so significant that his name still appears today on streets, in museums, and in songs throughout the archipelago. 6. An independence that arrived on a date still celebrated with national pride. On July 5, 1975, Cape Verde officially declared its independence from Portugal, just 1 year after the Carnation Revolution ended Portugal's dictatorship and set in motion the collapse of its colonial empire. The country's first president was Aristide Pereira, and for a time there was even an attempt to merge Cape Verde with Guinea-Bissau into a single state, a project that ultimately collapsed for good after a military coup in 1987. An active volcano that has destroyed entire villages, and yet people rebuild in the same spot anyway. The country's highest point is Pico do Fogo, an active volcano nearly 9,280 feet tall. Rising directly from an ancient caldera formed thousands of years ago after a colossal geological collapse. Its last eruption, in 2014, destroyed entire villages built within the caldera itself. And yet, the residents of those communities decided to rebuild their homes in the exact same location, a decision that says a great deal about the unique relationship Cape Verdeans have with their own volcanic land. 8. An island built for the most demanding hiking on the African continent. Santo Antão, the second largest island in the archipelago, is considered one of the best hiking destinations in all of Africa. Its vertical ravines, deep canyons, and hidden valleys create an ecosystem completely different from the rest of the islands, which are far more arid and desert-like. While most of Cape Verde looks like a lunar landscape, Santo Antão is covered in vegetation and fog forests, a contrast that surprises anyone visiting both islands on the same trip. 9. An island where the soil can literally be eaten. On the island of Sal lies a region known as the Red Island, whose soil is saturated with iron oxide, giving the earth an intense red color that's almost hard to believe when you see it. Local residents even use the red dust from the area as a spice in some traditional dishes, making this one of the most curious spots in the country, a place where you can, quite literally, eat part of the landscape. 10. A volcanic crater where the human body floats on its own. One of the most unique experiences Cape Verde has to offer is bathing in the Pedra de Lume crater on the island of Sal, an enormous volcanic caldera now filled with salt water so mineral-dense it surpasses even the Dead Sea in concentration. This means anyone who swims in its waters floats automatically without any effort at all, and its waters are also recognized for therapeutic properties benefiting skin and joint conditions. 11. A humble dish that became a national symbol. Kachupa is, without a doubt, Cape Verde's most representative dish, a slow-cooked stew made with different types of corn and beans, to which fish or meat can be added depending on each family's means. There are two main versions, Kachupa rica, with a variety of meats, and Kachupa pobre, much simpler, which for generations was the daily sustenance of the country's poorest classes. It's said that a good plate of Kachupa can, on its own, tell the story of an entire community. 12. More Cape Verdeans live outside Cape Verde than inside it. This is probably one of the most striking and least known facts about the entire country. Due to the devastating droughts that struck the archipelago throughout much of the 20th century, a massive migration of the population took place toward the United States, Europe, and other countries in Africa and South America. Today, the Cape Verdean diaspora outnumbers the population actually living on the islands, making Cape Verde one of the most extreme cases of diaspora anywhere in the world. 13. Surprising biodiversity for such a small territory. Despite having limited natural resources, Cape Verde is home to more than 100 bird species, several of them endemic, meaning they exist nowhere else on the planet. Among them are the Cape Verde swift and the Cape Verde lark. This ornithological richness has turned the archipelago into an increasingly popular destination for birdwatchers, an activity that draws specialized travelers from around the world in search of species they can't observe anywhere else. 14. One of the most important sanctuaries on the planet for an endangered turtle species. Cape Verde's beaches receive loggerhead sea turtles every year, an endangered species that comes to the archipelago between June and February to lay its eggs, making the country the third most important nesting site in the world for this species. Capturing or disturbing these turtles is strictly prohibited by law, and numerous local and international organizations work actively throughout the season to protect the nests and ensure the survival of the hatchlings. 15. A country that depends almost entirely on imported food. Only between 10 and 11% of Cape Verde's territory is suitable for agriculture, meaning around 90% of all the food consumed in the country has to be imported from abroad. This dependency makes the Cape Verdean economy especially vulnerable to shifts in international food prices, although local farmers have learned to make the most of every square foot of fertile land available, especially in the more humid valleys of islands like Santo Antão. 16. the island that receives the majority of the country's tourists. Of the 10 islands in the archipelago, Sal draws the largest number of international visitors each year, thanks to a beach stretching more than 5 miles of white sand and turquoise waters. But beyond the beach, Sal offers top-tier water sports, a steadily growing tourism infrastructure, and serves as the main gateway to the rest of the archipelago for most travelers visiting Cape Verde for the first time. 17. A country that relies heavily on international aid to sustain itself. Cape Verde is one of the countries that receives the most international aid per capita in the entire world, with funding from the European Union and the World Bank aimed at improving port and airport infrastructure and modernizing its fishing industry. Far from being a sign of weakness, this external support reflects a complex geographic reality. A small island nation with scarce rainfall and limited natural resources, which has managed to use that cooperation relatively efficiently, becoming a model of stability within the African continent. 18. One of the best destinations in the world for wind-based water sports. Thanks to its clean waters and constant natural winds, Cape Verde's coastline, especially on the islands of Sal and Boa Vista, has become a world reference point for windsurfing and kitesurfing. Every year, these islands host international-level competitions that draw some of the best athletes on the planet, turning a country this small into an unexpected powerhouse within the professional wind sports circuit. 19. 2 groups of islands defined solely by wind direction. The archipelago's 10 islands are geographically divided into 2 groups based on their exposure to the wind. The Barlavento Islands, more arid and windy, ideal for water sports, and the Sotavento Islands, sheltered from the wind, with a somewhat more humid climate and greater landscape diversity. This division isn't just a geographic curiosity, it also determines the type of vegetation, economic activities, and lifestyle of each island community. 20. A very famous naturalist who set foot on these islands before changing the history of science. Few people know that Cape Verde was the first destination Charles Darwin visited during his historic voyage aboard the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836. Darwin landed on the island of Santiago in January 1832 and spent 3 weeks exploring the archipelago, fascinated by the diversity of its volcanic landscapes. It was precisely during this stay that the young naturalist began developing his skills in geological observation, abilities that would prove fundamental years later in shaping his theory of evolution. 21. Just one site in the entire country declared a World Heritage Site. Cidade Velha, the historic center of the former Ribeira Grande, is the only site in Cape Verde included on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Beyond its preserved colonial architecture, it was a stopover for some of the most famous navigators in history, including Vasco da Gama in 1497 and Christopher Columbus in 1498. Walking its streets today is, in a way, stepping through a portal straight into the 15th century. 22. The only truly native mammal on the islands. Of all the terrestrial wildlife in Cape Verde, only one mammal is genuinely native to the archipelago, the Cape Verde long-eared bat, which accounts for roughly 20% of all mammal species recorded in the country and which inhabited these islands long before the arrival of the first humans. Its presence is a quiet reminder that despite centuries of human intervention, traces of the archipelago's original nature still survive. 23. A national spirit that closely resembles Caribbean rum, but with its own identity. Grog is Cape Verde's traditional liquor, made from the fermentation and distillation of sugarcane juice, with an alcohol content that can exceed 40%. It's traditionally served as a welcome or celebration drink, and its production is especially important on the island of Santo Antão, where the humidity of the mountain valleys allows for high-quality raw material for distillation. 24. A country without a single railway line in its entire history. Cape Verde has never had any kind of train system. All internal transportation happens by air between the different islands or by road within each one. Despite this apparent limitation, the country has developed a fairly efficient network of domestic airports, allowing quick, frequent flights between islands, while the port of Mindelo, on the island of São Vicente, has functioned as a strategic refueling stop for ships since the 19th century. 25. A goat-to-person ratio that surprises any visitor. It's estimated that Cape Verde has roughly 1 goat for every 2 residents in the country. These animals were introduced by Portuguese colonizers in the 15th century as a source of food and milk, and they adapted so well to the arid, rocky terrain of the islands that they have multiplied steadily for centuries. Today, they remain essential to the domestic economy of many rural families, especially for producing handmade cheese. 26. A social norm that practically requires sharing food in public. In Cape Verde, eating in front of other people without offering them some of your food is considered a serious breach of manners. This custom has deep roots in the history of a people who for centuries lived under the constant threat of hunger and who learned that collective solidarity was the only real way to survive. That spirit of shared generosity is still alive today, and it's one of the traits that most surprises and moves foreign visitors. 27. A flag loaded with island symbolism. Cape Verde's flag features a blue background representing the ocean and sky, crossed by white and red stripes, over which sits a circle of 10 golden stars, each representing one of the archipelago's 10 main islands. Blue evokes the sea surrounding the country, white symbolizes peace, and red represents the historic effort and sacrifice of the Cape Verdean people, visually summarizing the identity of a nation scattered across the ocean. 28. The smallest inhabited island known as the archipelago's secret garden. Brava is the smallest of Cape Verde's inhabited islands, affectionately known as the Garden Island thanks to its abundant tropical vegetation. Unlike most of the other islands, Brava has no sandy beaches, but instead vertical cliffs dropping directly into the sea, giving it an imposing, wild appearance. It's one of the least crowded destinations in the country, ideal for those seeking authenticity far from the busiest tourist circuits. 29. A curious historical connection to one of the 20th century's best-known dictators. On the island of Sal, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini once acquired the rights to build an airport meant to serve as a refueling stop for flights between Europe and South America, infrastructure that Portugal eventually purchased in 1945, after the end of World War II. The same island once also had a small tramway, built solely to transport salt from a volcanic crater to the port, whose remains can still be visited today as a testament to a past era of intense salt trading. 30. The voice that brought Cape Verdean music to the world's biggest stages. No overview of Cape Verde would be complete without mentioning Cesária Évora, the country's most internationally recognized artist, known as the Barefoot Diva for her habit of performing without shoes in solidarity with her country's poorest communities. Her music, deeply rooted in traditional genres like morna and coladera, carried the culture of these islands to audiences around the globe, becoming internationally recognized musical heritage. 31. One of the most stable democracies on the entire African continent. Since the early 90s, Cape Verde has established itself as one of the most functional and stable democracies in all of Africa. While many countries in the region have gone through coups, armed conflict, and chronic instability, Cape Verde has maintained a sustained system of democratic alternation, a considerable achievement on a continent where democratic governance remains an enormous challenge for many nations, and one that stands as perhaps the most valuable asset this small island country holds for its future. And so we reach the end of this journey through Cape Verde, a country tiny in size but immense in history, culture, and resilience. 10 volcanic islands that were born uninhabited and today sustain an identity all their own, forged through droughts, migrations, music, and a capacity for rebuilding that seems to know no limit. If you made it this far, you now know Cape Verde better than the vast majority of people in the entire world. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like, subscribe with the bell turned on, and tell us in the comments what surprised you the most about everything you just discovered. See you on the next journey.